Happy Sunday, everyone. Well, this week, actually last night, I was out looking at the sky and it was absolutely gorgeous. And it had me think about an old analogy that I had remembered from, it's Robert Jastrow. He was the former head of NASA's Goddard Center. And he was trying to explain the universe in a way that might be a little easier to understand for those of us that are not, physicists and all that kind of thing. So he said, imagine that your sun, our sun, is the size of an orange. So for our purposes, an apple will be playing the part of an orange today because that's what's in my refrigerator. So he said, the sun is an orange. Then in comparison, our earth would be the size of a grain of sand. And he said, the grain of sand, which is the earth, would be rotating the sun about 30 feet out. So I thought about that. I thought, okay, that's about the length of my driveway. So if I'm holding an orange in the entrance to my garage, and Stephen, my husband, is standing at the end of the driveway holding a grain of sand, he could rotate. He actually can't because the house gets in the way, but he could rotate around my orange, and that would be an example of the earth rotating the sun. And then he went on to say, and Jupiter, which is 11 times larger than the earth, would be like a cherry pit. And if I'm holding my orange in my garage, the cherry pit would be 1 block down. Okay. Saturn, also a cherry pit, would be 2 blocks down, and they're then orbiting around my garage, hence the orange, which is the sun. And that kind of gives you an idea. Pluto, which I don't know when I was a kid, it was a planet. I don't know if it's been downgraded or upgraded or what's happened with that. But anyways, Pluto, another grain of sand. Pluto would be 10 blocks away. And then he went on to say, and so that kind of gives me an idea. Sun, 10 blocks away, there's Pluto. And then, of course, within our galaxy, there are lots of solar systems, lots of suns with lots of oranges with grains of sand and cherry pits rotating around them. And he said the average distance between the oranges, between the suns of the different solar systems, with this continuing using this kind of spacing, is about 2,000 miles. So that I'm thinking, okay, so the next orange I'm in Minnesota, is in Southern California. And then he went on to say, and then if you take all of these suns that we've got that are about 2,000 miles apart using this representation, our galaxy would be 20 million miles in diameter. That's if this is the size of our sun. Now, I can't really understand 20 million miles. The actual distance is over 100,000 light years, which I can understand even less. So, but you're kind of getting the drift of this. And then he said that we found out with the Hubble Space Telescope that there are probably 125 billion galaxies. Okay, at this point, my mind, has kind of let go. It's pretty awesome, isn't it? And then I was thinking, this is what Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, wrote well before the Hubble telescope. He said, God is the silent voice that speaks into visibility all the life there is. This power builds with hands deft beyond comprehension and keeps going with all the intricate machinery, universe upon universe, one within another, yet never conflicting. Okay, that's pretty awesome, isn't it? Whatever our definition, but the Godness that creates everything, creates this amazing, complex, ever-expanding universe, which is expanded well beyond what I could ever comprehend. And then I love what Ernest Holmes, another New Thought, wonderful teacher, said, and he says, all the power and intelligence of the universe is already within, waiting to be utilized. Okay, so the intelligence of the universe is within. I think Jesus of Nazareth said, heaven is within. we have a huge potential within us. We know the abundance of the universe, how it often shows up for us is an abundance of ideas or also an abundance of opportunity. And that's an important one to remember, because sometimes, I don't know about you, but I can get caught up with that, oh, I must do this because this is my one opportunity to do it. And that's not the case. Because some people will say to me, oh, I want to take your class, but I can't take your class because of blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, it's not the only class that'll be perfect for you. And the information that is yours to glean from this class will be available to you in other classes, in other formats. It is an abundant universe. I think about back in 1988, I had decided I wanted to be a Unity minister. And things happened that I didn't end up doing that at that time. But forward, and I did get ordained in 1998. Okay. But the people who were in the class of 93, which might have been just that might have been where my class was. It's interesting, I ended up being close to a number of them. Two became very good friends, one still is, and one is no longer with us, but I joined his ministry and then led it after he left. I thought, I got to know the people that I would have known if I'd been in that class that were special to me anyway. They all ended up in Minneapolis, even including me. And none of us were in Minneapolis, and the rest of them had never been there before. And we all end up together. So there's an abundance of opportunities for things to show up. You've probably experienced that in your life as well. So I was thinking this week, how do we use this amazing intelligence that created the cosmos, that created all these galaxies? And it's available for us. How do we use it? Now, we make hundreds and hundreds of decisions every day. And a lot of those are just automatic. I made a decision once, and now I'm sticking with it. I made a decision a long time ago. I'm going to brush my teeth a couple times a day. I have stuck with that decision. I really don't have to contemplate it anymore. I just do it. And you probably got lots of those decisions that we have made once, and then they feel good. But I was thinking about with Gerald Jampolsky, and he's one of my favorites. He said, if the mechanism we use to make decisions is unknown, we are doomed to make poor choices. So I don't want all my decisions to be those automatic ones. Or I may want to change some of my automatic decisions. So I was thinking about, how do we make decisions? Well, sometimes we just repeat what we've learned. Which reminds me of what's the story of the young newlywed gal who was cooking a small roast for her husband and cut off the ends, and he asked her why she cut off the ends. She goes, well, you have to cut off the ends of the roast before you put it in the oven. And then at some point later, her sister explained to her that their mother always cut off the ends of the roast because their pan was not big enough to hold that family-size roast. And that was the reason they cut them off. She had no idea why you had to do it. She just knew you had to do it. And there are a lot of things that have been continued over time. I heard about, it was kind of pointing through time, the solid rocket boosters that help lift the rockets up and everybody up to the space station. And those solid rocket, you can tell this is my expertise, But anyway, the engineers wanted to make them a little bit bigger, a little fatter, but they couldn't because had to make them so that they're built in Utah and they put them on a train and send them to the launch site. And they have to go through train tunnels. And train tunnels are made just enough to clear the train box or whatever, And train tracks are 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart, which seems like a really odd measurement, doesn't it? And they're all that way in the United States, traditional train tracks. Now you can trace that back. Why is that? And that determines, of course, how big the load is, which turned how big the tunnel was, which is how big the solid booster rockets could be. And then we go, well, why was that? And you go backwards. Well, the engineers who designed a lot of the tracks in the United States were from Great Britain. And in Great Britain, tracks 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart. Why is that? Well, because before they had the train tracks, they had tram tracks, and those were 4 feet 8. And why was that? Well, because they had tooled all of the they made the wheels for wagons and what have you, with the wheels all being the same distance apart, 4 feet, 8.5 inches, which would make sense because if you are in a wet, rutted country where there is no asphalt invented yet, you want to be able to follow in the same ruts. You don't want to be in a different rut. We, in this part of the country, would say if you go cross-country skiing, isn't it nice if you have the tracks that are nice and not spread out, so you'd have to, that would not work well. And so the same with tracks. And so the tracks on the roads and all the wheels distances were 4 feet, 8.5 inches. And you're going, well, why was that? Well, because, of course, that's what they were in Europe. And that was because the people who were, when they started making these roads, it was for the Romans, and they would have war chariots, and they made their wheels wide enough so that they could get 2 horses in there. So, in other words, the reason that we have the 4 feet, 8.5 inches is so we can have 2 horse butts in there, which is kind of interesting and can be kind of limiting. And so now when we create new things, when you have light rail and when you have monorails and you have other things, you have to let go of the Roman chariot horse posteriors as your guiding influence. So sometimes things just, you're getting my point. We can, sometimes when we look back, we go, oh, okay, I think we'll make new decisions now. We can. We don't have to be restricted by something just because it always was that way. Now, another way that I have been known to make decisions is logic. Pros and cons, that kind of thing. And so when I go to the grocery store, now my grocery store has the units of how much everything costs underneath, so you can figure it out really easily. But when I go to some stores, Target, they don't have that. So I get out my phone and my calculator and I figure out the big box of rice or the medium box of rice, which is the best deal. It's surprising sometimes. So I use what I call logic, using weights and measures and so on. And that works well and also. Then there's another way that we make decisions, and that's with intuition. And I love what Charles Fillmore says about this. He says, there is that in man and woman, which when opened, will place them in direct contact with universal knowledge and enable them instantly and continuously to draw forth anything they wish to know. In other words, there is within us, using our intuition, we can draw forth answers without having to do pros and cons, without having to do a lot of rational discourse. It's always there and doesn't require a lot of complex thinking. And we use it a lot. You may not be aware of it. Now, I used to do something similar to that early on, and that was the first thing that came into my mind, I would go with that. Oh, that sounds like a good idea. Not exactly the same thing. By using the first thing that came into my mind, I ended up being a psych major and then ended up with double concentrations in law enforcement and corrections in school. And I'm not into guns. And anyway, so I graduated with those. And I'll tell you, the reason that I chose law enforcement and corrections is there are a lot of cute boys in the classes. This is always a very good reason to choose your future career. So that is not what I'm talking about with intuition. Intuition, is that faculty of knowing that we have, that we get to really encourage it, and so that we begin to decipher when it speaks to us. And it takes a while because initially it's like, is that intuition or is that just one of those thoughts that pops into my head, of which I have thousands and thousands that happen all the time? And I was thinking of a story that I heard about a young man. And he had been to a Wednesday night class, and the discussion was how to feel that direct connection with the divine. And so, and then after the class, they went out for coffee and pie, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. And he got into his car, and he just was, still, they'd been talking about this, and he was excited about it. And so he was saying, I really want to feel that connection with my divinity. I want to feel that connection, that direct knowing, that sense of oneness. And so he started driving in his car, and the thought came into his head to stop and buy a gallon of milk. And he had no idea where that thought came from. But he's decided, okay, I'll stop and get a gallon of milk. Who knows, I can always use a gallon of milk. So he stopped, got a gallon of milk, got back in the car, he's driving, and he'd gone past 7th Street, and another idea came in that he wasn't, what he was consciously thinking about, and it said, turn. He's going, why would I turn? That's not my direction. And he went another block, and it got consistent. Turn on 7th. So he was in that space where he's receptive. So he turned around, went around the block, went down 7th, and then, he's in this frame of being open and receptive, but yet, we're observers, and he's going, this is really weird. And he's driving, and he's in this area and driving a couple more blocks, and he said, that still small voice, or whatever you want to call it, that thought that comes in, said, pull over. So he pulled over, still thinking, okay, what am I doing? I'm in and he said it's kind of a semi-industrial residential area. Not the really bad part of town, but not a really, upscale part of town. And it's 10 o'clock at night. Most of the houses look dark, like people are either not home or already in bed. And then he gets the direction that says, go across the street and knock on that door and bring them the milk. Can you imagine? Okay, he's going to go knock at night, wake somebody up, and give them milk. And so he sat in the car for a little bit, but at this point he was receptive. He got out of the car, went across the street, and he said he had made a deal with himself. He was going to knock on the door or ring the bell and wait just a few seconds, and if nobody was, then he was going to quick dash back to the car. So he rang the bell, and in just a few seconds he heard a kind of sort of a gruff voice, but it's like, who is it? And the door opened, because he didn't know what he was going to say. And there was a man at the door, and he was, he looked like he was really tired, like maybe he woke him up, he wasn't sure. And all he could think to do was just, here! And he handed him the milk. The guy grabbed the milk and ran down the hall, and he's talking in Spanish, so he couldn't, and the young man couldn't understand what he was saying. But he was just kind of standing in the door watching this, going, what is going on here? And then what happened is, then a young woman came out the same hall that the man had run down with the milk and ran towards the kitchen, like he figured. And then behind him ran the man who was holding a crying baby, and went to the kitchen and then came back. And the young man still at the door going, what's going on here? And the man said to him, he said, my wife and I were just praying because we had extra bills this month and we ran out of money and we didn't have any money to go buy milk for our baby. And we were praying to God that as to what we should do. And then the woman came out of the kitchen. She goes, are you an angel? And the guy, what are you going to? No, he didn't say that. He said, but he had what he did in that moment, which perhaps many people said. I grabbed my wallet and took out all the bills I had and just, handed them to the man before he could say anything. I turned around and walked back to my car, and as he was walking back to his car, he said the tears were just running down his face, because he allowed himself to be guided, and look what happened. Now, when I first heard that story, I thought, well, that's kind of out there. I don't know that I would go up to a stranger's door with milk. But then I thought, yes, but, and I bet you've got stories too, those stories where we stepped out and we did something that did not make sense, perhaps was beyond logic, but intuitively it felt like the right thing to do. For me, it was, quitting a really good job that I loved in a place I loved to live and moving 1,900 miles across the country without a job, blah, blah, blah. Or, and then as I was talking to Stephen about this, he said, well, yeah, and how about when we then decided during the height of that recession, where you really didn't want to be selling your house, we decided to move so that we could go and pursue a new ministry. We step out, and I'm sure you've got stories of that as well, where we follow our intuition, we follow our knowing. And of course, we know that when we acknowledge that we have this capability, and then we create space to simply hear answers. And what Stephen and I would do when we were contemplating coming back to Minnesota is we would go walk in the redwoods. And when we walked in the redwoods, it gave us space to hear and get the next divine nudge of what we were to do next. And then just be open. So I thought, okay, so sometimes some of my decisions are automatic. Some of them I use logic. More and more I use my intuition. And then another piece too is I double check to make sure, am I making a decision out of love or fear? Now I simplify everything because I like things kind of simple. If it's not love, it's some form of fear. So, and sometimes that might, for different people, it may look differently. So don't, everyone, and here's another thing. We think that if everyone uses these same tools, we will all make the same decisions, and we will not. Because we're all unique expressions having different experiences. So this week I was looking at some of those because I was using my own intuition and I was doing love and fear. And it had to do with what's going on right now, and that was I was invited to a barbecue that is a board of directors I'm on was invited to one of our contractors to go to they're having a barbecue for us. And I thought about it, and the other board members are going. And I thought about it, and I thought, out of love, I'm choosing not to go because I, out of love, am choosing to still socially distance and stay home. And for me, that's the right choice. And you say, well, that's out of fear of getting COVID? No. What it is out of the great value and love I have for my husband and for me. That it feels right, that the thing to do to really safeguard and keep us happy and healthy and all those things is to follow those guidelines right now. And that's making sense for me. And for someone else, it may be a different decision. But I make sure that I'm doing it out of love. And I like what Charles Fillmore said. He said, fear is one of the most subtle and destructive errors that the mind experiences. And fear will make a mistake, fear will get it wrong, fear will miss out on something, all kinds of fears. And sometimes fears paralyze us and we make no decision whatsoever. So it's not so much to eliminate fear, it's just to make sure that it's not running the show. Because there are times we're afraid, and that's fine, and our bodies can handle that. And when fears come in, we can release that well. If we hang on to it by continuing to ruminate about it, then it seems it does not serve our bodies well, it does not serve our psyches well, and it certainly doesn't help us make good decisions. So I move back into a loving space, and then it's easier to make those choices. I love what Ram Dass says. He says, the next message you need is always right where you are. Isn't that nice to know? Don't have to do anything. Don't have to, do some incantation and rotate counterclockwise 6 times or whatever it is to get the right answer. All you have to do is know, I'm here, I'm ready. And one way to do that is to ask a good question, isn't it? And when I say by good questions, well, I'm not alone in that. When Thomas Edison was asked if he had 1 hour to solve a problem, what would he do? And he said he would spend 55 minutes formulating a really good question. And then he said, because the solution will be immediate once I get the good question. Which is probably the Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I'm going to fit that in there too. It's like one good question and you're off and running. And we want to make our questions with good premise, and also to make sure that we aren't leading ourselves down some rabbit hole that's not going to serve us well. So I was trying to think, what is one of the questions we ask in our house sometimes that wasn't a good premise, which is, why can't I ever find anything? Can you see the Velcro on my, yeah, it's up there when you go into, oh my goodness, poor me. You might have all kinds, and a lot of times those questions with premises that don't serve us start with why. Why me? Why does this always happen to me? Why can't I do this? Why do you know? It starts when we were kids, because that was the question I used to ask my parents. I don't know if you did that too, where I was, why, and why, and then as you get teenagers, it's why can't I? Why can't I? Why? And we kind of can hang on to that if we're not real conscious about it. And we keep asking why questions. And what they do, why can't I ever find anything? Well, first off, it's a false premise, because I really find most things, because actually I'm actually fully dressed and I've found everything I needed to be here with you today. Okay, so the idea that I can't find things is false. Then there's also the idea, if we ask a question with a lousy premise, remember, all the thoughts that have come into us through our years are in there in our archives. And if you ask a question with a lousy premise, you're going to get all that stuff coming out, and it doesn't mean it's true. When we talk about divine intelligence within, it's not talking about that within, which is just the archive of everything we've heard. They're different, aren't they? So, why can't I ever find anything? Well, if I'm not careful, and if I ask that question, it'll go into my archives and it'll say, well, because. And then it'll tell me the things that my mother said, that, well, you don't put things away. Well, you're sloppy. You aren't paying attention. You're a daydreamer. You're blah, 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 blah. Then, it'll tell me things that other people have told me that those, and doesn't mean they're true, but it just means that they've gone into my head. I've heard them. And why can't I ever find anything? Well, things are tricky, and the world is out to get me. Oh, that's a good one. What else have I been told? Oh, and then if you've been watching television and they had commercials, then why can't I find anything? Well, I obviously have a brain tumor or some kind of neurological disorder that only can be corrected if I take this pill. So that's why I can't find anything. You can see what's happening here, can't you? So instead, we come up with good questions. And a lot of good questions start with, what is one thing? One thing I can do that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. Okay, so I can't. And so when I ask that question, what is one thing I can do that will help me to find things easily? That by doing it, everything will be easier and a lot of stuff unnecessary. And when I asked that question, I came up with the ideas that came in. Again, divine ideas will come in. Good question. If you ask a good question. And so the idea was, why don't you make a list of things that you put in totes? We have a garage full of totes. You might have a few of those around your house as well, which is really helpful until you find that you've got 3 of everything, because you don't know where everything is, and it's easier to get another one than it is to find where it was. Well, now I have an inventory list and books as well, so I don't have to go get multiple copies of the same book or download another book that I already have, because I have a list. Ooh, this is pretty exciting, isn't it? So whatever it might be, and so we started coming up with all kinds of ideas, and then it was so fun. We then you can ask the question more than once. Once you've got that one answer, you can say, what is one thing I can do? And then it was, well, you might want to organize. Oh, well, that's a great idea. And that will help us find things. And then I asked the question again a little bit later, and it was like, what's one thing I can do so that I can always find everything? And it was, well, what's your affirmation about finding things? And then it was like, create an affirmation that says that I can always find what I'm looking for, easily and effortlessly. Okay? So here's if you're thinking, okay, what are some questions in different areas? And so feel free, if one of these is a question that you want to ask, just tune out and then just ask that question. So in your spiritual life, what's one thing I can do to deepen my connection with Source? Something come? Great. What's one thing I can do to build my faith? If it's your physical health, what's one thing I can do to achieve my fitness goals? One thing. That by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. What's one thing I can do to relieve my stress? Or in relationships, what's one thing I can do to improve my relationship with my spouse, my partner? Children, what's one thing I can do to nurture my children? That by doing it, everything else will be easier or maybe even unnecessary. Oh, good question. Your job, what's one thing I can do to further my career? What's one thing I can do to help my team succeed? That by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. You're getting the drift on this, huh? My finances, what is one thing I can do to eliminate credit card debt? What is one thing I can do to increase my net worth? Whatever your questions are, just ask for one thing. And remember, as Ram Dass said, the next message you need is always right where you are. So we ask that question from the expectation that the divine is here to serve us, to assist us, to bring us all those great ideas and opportunities that we could, more than we could ever possibly want. And when we know that, then we can relax, breathe, and live from that place that knows that within us is the intelligence that created this cosmos. And we start to get a little mini felt sense of what that is. And then that grows and grows. So you don't have to understand light years. You don't have to understand even oranges and sand. You don't have to understand any of that. But to start taking in that felt experience of what it is like to have the intelligence of Godness within. May that be your experience today. Namaste. And so it is.